And so with that, we have Dr. Wolf again doing a deeper dive into some of her own research. Thank you.
Hi again, everyone. And jump right in, a continuation of some of the work and ideas that I presented this morning, but a little more focus on mental health, and then a translation of what this research about people, health response, what that means for the types of programs that are being innovated and introduced across communities, perhaps again, giving you more ideas for this notion of reframing. And living in Seattle, you've probably either visited or heard that there's a good bit of rain there. And frankly, if you stand still for very long, moss and lichens start to grow on you. It's so damp. But the consequence of that is that there are some really outstanding tree spaces. And I understand that the Community Partners in Community Forestry Conference will be held this year in November in the Seattle area. If you plan or would like to attend, please spend a little extra time and look around at some of the large trees. So I enjoy backpacking and I enjoy hiking and other outdoor activities. And every once in a while we encounter a big Doug fir, western red cedar, spruce, and Dr. Ritter is one of the most effective tree geek speakers I have ever heard. And he probably would not use, yes. And I don't think he would use this term, but you can hear my group when we're hiking and we see one of these trees, there's a mumble of, that's a big ass tree. And so these sorts of things are, again, various sizes, various species, various growth forms, which Dr. Ritter explained. They are an influence in our lives in a variety of ways. And much of the research that I'm sharing with you has actually been done in more northern, temperate, wetter climates. And I realize that, but I think the principles, and there's not a lot of research has been done in drier and more desert climates. But I think we can translate a number of these findings to the environments. When you think about creating nature spaces, that include trees. But it's not just the presence of plants, it's how you create space and place with them. And my master's degree is in landscape architecture. And that's what I learned in that brief period of my professional life, is it's not just the vegetation, not just the plant material, but at the sort of space and mood and character of place that one creates with that. And I really appreciate that no one booed when I said landscape architect, because sometimes I know there's some tensions. That said, there are opportunities for greening, regreening, or as one of my colleagues calls it, rewilding urban places. Takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of hard work, takes care in plant selection and then ongoing management. But there are these opportunities, and we can then use them to promote the various wellness benefits that I've been describing. And let's see, how's that? Not getting a forward on that slide. Help back there. There we go. And another example, again, with care, with thought, with planning, and then ongoing management. The sorts of places that nurture people's health, I think, can be created in all types of climates and all types of environments. I was once invited to speak in a community in Mexico, and it was fascinating because we went out for a drive around, walk and talk about green stormwater infrastructure. And the extreme care and placement of materials to collect water and keep it contained and focused around the plant material. I even learned that the extent of where one places stones and their angle, because stones can help to capture water and angle it into that growth area more effectively. Really micro scale things to do and innovate, but there are possibilities. All right, a little bit of a reminder, particularly for those who maybe are just joining us now by way of streaming. Nature is but one social determinant of health. And this is a term, it's a framing that public health officials and medical professionals are using more and more, recognizing that it's not only what happens when you arrive at the hospital or the clinic or the doctor's office, but what it is, the conditions that surround your entire life that make a difference in one's health. And I introduced a scoping review, a journal article that we did, just a quick recap of that again, get you back in the mindset after thinking about xylem and phloem for the last hour. Many articles winnowed down through a series of decision points and review of those articles, then to a final collection of about 200. Generally, very generally, top level message about what we found is trees and nearby nature promote general wellness. We may be healthy, we may feel fine, some anxiety, some stress periodically, but having nature in our surroundings and access by views or walking through it, around it, has health consequences. And then if we are diagnosed with a disease or a disorder or a mental condition, then there are opportunities through experiences of trees in the urban forest to provide treatment and therapy. And I asked when I last spoke about thinking about framing and how that relates to your own work, your own firm, your own clients. And one group in North Carolina, I was speaking at an event like this, and a couple of guys said, hey, come on out to the demo area in the parking lot. And I thought, what's going on here? And of course, there were the lifts and the chipper trucks and all sorts of things, the latest technologies. But these guys had completely revamped their marketing message for their firm. So I got a really cool cap and a t-shirt that said, healthy trees, healthy people. So while they pay particular attention to tree care and take advantage of research about the how of caring for trees, choosing trees, sustaining their growth, they're also doing a major marketing campaign about the effect on clients and customers. If we look across this research, what are some of the latest developments? What I am seeing is this idea of dosage. There's enough work out there that people are starting to say, great, you know, you have experience of green, a view, you're walking about, and but how often, how much? And this really relates to the medical community because they have guidelines, say, for physical activity. It's recommended that we as adults do about 120 minutes of moderate activity per week. And that is walking, cycling, really basic stuff, not really high exertion exercise necessarily. Well, this idea of dosage is starting to carry over into nature experience as well. And we haven't narrowed it to a very specific guideline, but you can see some pattern here across some of these studies, right? Stress reduction. They found results after about 20 to 30 minutes. Depression and blood pressure response, positive response, about 30 minutes a week, and so on. You can see these different numbers. So what we're seeing is sessions of 20 to 30 minutes are of value, approximately 120 minutes a week. The takeaway here is it's not a one and done experience. So nature experience then becomes part of one's lifestyle. Repeated, brief exposures. So you might think about that when you're maybe working with a designer or doing a design yourself is, how are the places arranged? What's the connectivity of nature within a community where this opportunity is possible for either a brief session, 20, 30 minutes, or being able to move for some distance within a space? Another interpretation of this research is being very recently shared by an urban forester, planner, and really policy. He's always out there on the front edge. Cecil Kaninendijk. It took me about a year to realize how to pronounce his name, but Cecil is now promoting a readily memorable figure, 330-300. So for health and climate outcomes, 3 trees visible from your window, primarily from your home. 30% canopy cover. And there's a good bit of research emerging that shows that 30% canopy is kind of 30 to 40% is kind of a magic number in terms of people's mental health response in particular. And then 300 yards, the UN, United Nations, other World Health Organization are now promoting 300 meters / 300 yards for access to a green space from your home. So this starts to get at the walkability. It starts to get at being able to be in spaces where one can do physical activity for a length of time. The headline or the title of this talk was to include diversity and equity. And there's been a good bit of research recognizing that there are disparities in the distribution of trees and parks across cities, often with less affluent communities and often more culturally diverse communities having less nature. So I'm not going to recount that research, but just to let you know that it is out there. And I'm committed and working with other groups, and we're trying to figure out how to introduce more nature into these communities, in not only for the sake of health, but to culturally acknowledge differences in how people think about trees or vegetation more generally, including species, including integration of art, perhaps, including spaces for cultural events such as food fairs or performances, things like that. So the diversity and equity certainly plays out in terms of health. One finding that's fairly common is if there's a community of people, and this relates to household also, that has greater health challenge, the introduction of nature moves them to a greater degree of health benefit. And if you think about that in your own life, if your health is more compromised, treatment takes you to another level of wellness, more so than if you're feeling really good and you take some vitamins or improve your diet a little bit. You might get a little bit of improvement, but not a great deal. So thinking about the difference in increment of benefit, depending on when and how much green is introduced, is another dimension of equity. In the review that we did, what we found is there were certain, you might remember the quality of evidence, the red, yellow, green. What we're finding is in that green zone, mental health is one of the responses that is most consistently and from a science evidence quality appearing in this research. So I'd like to go forward and share some of the highlights of that research. And this has really been called to greater attention during this time of COVID, because if we look across the public health data over the last decade or two, we see a gradual increase in mental health concerns. And it's taken another spike during the COVID period because of isolation, because of change in routines, because of change in employment. Our kids can't get into school necessarily in the same way. Too much Zooming, all of that. And I've had far more people, journalists, writers, and such contact me of late, not about health in general, but mental health in particular. So this might be another framing that you use when talking about people is ask them, well, how do you feel? Stressed? Anxious? Hey, take a walk in nature. Hey, we can plant some trees if we think about it in a thoughtful way and provide those environments for improved mental health. Another dimension of this that I'm encountering, and maybe it's because I'm in academia and we're talking about big systems of climate change and whatnot, but from a psychological perspective, there's this term solastalgia. And solastalgia refers to a psychological sense of grief or loss for changing conditions, particularly having to do with nature. And what I'm hearing from writers, from students in particular, young people are really, the solastalgia is really kicking in on them. They're wondering, what's our life going forward? What does the future hold and what can we do about it? And that inspires me, that because they often have that question, what can we do about it? In my part of the country now, wildfire. We are seeing wildfire in places. The early onset in the season, the intensity of it, and the distribution of it. We're starting to see wildfire actually creeping into urban areas where it used to be wildlands greater distance away from the city. And I suspect you might be encountering some of that in some of the communities here in Mexico and Arizona, Colorado as well. So that's all to say that trees, parks, and green space from an equity standpoint should be accessible to all. And that goes into policy and planning in communities. Where are new parks created? Where are trees planted? And there's so many factors that go into those decisions in terms of plantability, species suitability, risk and threat factors, and so on. But now also thinking about equity as a component of that. Who will benefit from the placement of these trees? And can we become a little more intentional about that? All right, some of the highlights of the research: mental health in terms of general wellness and in terms of treatment and therapy. And by the way, I was asked after the other presentation whether these slides will be available, and I will provide them to the event organizers. I understand they'll go up on a website shortly, so I will be sure to get those to you. And again, if you have any follow-up questions, you can contact me. As Dr. Ritter said, if you Google search my name and human dimensions of urban forestry, it should come up pretty quickly. All right, depression. This is one of those clinical controlled random trial studies. So it's most robust in the minds of the medical community. And that is, so Mark Berman is at the University of Chicago, and what they did is they recruited people they were diagnosed with depression, treatable depression. Half of the group went on a walk through a residential neighborhood having fewer trees, the red line, and others walking through an area having more trees, the green line. Then some weeks later, they switched the groups. So if you will, they got an internal control of the other factors that might contribute to depression by having the same people in these two situations. There you can see better cognition, in other words, processing of information, attention to and focus in their lives, improved affect or emotion. And all of this simply after walking for about an hour in these different types of settings. This was also, we found, I collaborated with a group and we accessed health data from senior living centers across the nation, then plunk those places on a map, use NDVI, which is a satellite remote sensing approach to estimating vegetation, and we see a pattern. People living in places having more trees show less depression symptoms. And there's a buffer on this that extends out about 300 meters or so. So it's beyond the facility itself, but it's also a fairly short distance. So we think about what are the overlap. I'm working with some city planners and we're trying to think about what is this overlap of effect so that if you're living in one place and you move about, or your life involves driving, walking, riding, whatever, through a community, how do you get this sort of overlap of effect? Because there are a number of studies showing this type of buffer effect, up to about 300, maybe 600 meters. Walking. So overlay walking for physical activity, which promotes a variety of wellness benefits, with walking for psychological benefit. And a colleague of mine, Greg Bratman, is understanding how the brain works when we're walking. And the key term here is rumination. What do we mean by that? Well, I don't know if you had this experience, but when I'm feeling anxious or down, moody, I tend to dwell on negative thoughts. And that's what he finds, is that when we're depressed, it keeps kind of spiraling in deeper and deeper to negative thoughts about life or what you've done or what you haven't done and so on. And so what he finds is when people are out walking in nature, more so than when they're in a gym and just being active, they lift out of this rumination cycle. Is it distraction? Is it something that actually happens in the physiology of the brain? Don't know for sure, but rumination then is decreased during these nature activities. We are so busy now, and we are doing so many tasks that require very directed attention. I do a lot of writing at my keyboard, all the Zoom stuff that's going on, preparing reports, doing analysis, budgets, paperwork. No, not any other time in the history of human beings have we spent so much time sitting in place, focused very narrowly on a task. And what this does, it depletes our possibility or our capacity to continue to pay attention. And it's called attention depletion, studied in a number of situations. And this response to it, a nature-based response to it, as studied by Rachel and Stephen Kaplan at the University of Michigan, is the idea of attention restoration theory. So not simply taking a break, but intentionally taking a break in a nature space that supports attention restoration can be really valuable. What does it help us to do? We improve our directed attention. We're able to return to the task with sort of renewed ability. It improves cognitive fatigue. And what happens with if we continue to feel this kind of jamming of, I think of it as a mental thickness. It's like, yeah, I'm not processing very well. I need to take a break. We can become frustrated. We can become impulsive, more aggressive towards other people around us. So this has implications not only for ourselves and our productivity, but for other people in our household or in our workplace. The Kaplans have discovered there are certain elements of outdoor environments that promote attention restoration. So being away, and this doesn't mean taking a long drive or a long vacation or far away from the city. It is about a momentary being away, outdoor space that feels separate from where you've been working quite so hard. Extent, it's large enough so you feel you can kind of spread out, maybe do a little bit of a walk. You don't feel confined. Compatibility, that it has affordances or it has elements that enable you to restore oneself. So there might be maybe there's some small food snack service, something like that. So when you're in that space, other needs that you may have are satisfied. One that I find really interesting, and I've tried to incorporate it into my life, is soft fascination. In other words, there are elements of nature that draw our attention to them without effort. What are some parts or pieces of soft fascination in the natural world? What are you thinking about? Yell them out. Wildlife, yes, animals. And it might be insects, it might be squirrels, birds, bird feeders, very popular, becoming more popular as something for nature watching. What else? Color and pattern. So the change across the day, across a season, across the year. And subtle, some people just don't have the attention necessarily or the capacity to recognize that, but others really enjoy that. What else? Light. So the change of light, again, outdoor, shadow and sun, and wind kind of associated with that. Wind patterns in the vegetation. So you get it. All of these things, if they're intentionally available to a person while they're outdoors, that can really help with this cognitive restoration ability. And there's some really interesting research having been done primarily in the northeastern United States about the presence of nature in residential neighborhoods and crime reduction. And these are, the studies are focused on neighborhoods that tend to have a higher crime rate anyway. Michelle Kondo is a Forest Service investigator who's been doing some of this work. And in fact, I think she's doing a presentation today with the Forest Service. But if you, Kondo, if you wish to look at more of this. But what they're finding is that by cleaning up vacant lots, planting trees in neighborhoods, the crime rate is going down. Might be several reasons for that. One is perhaps more social cohesion. Jane Jacobs, the great Jane Jacobs writing about cities, finding that certain characteristics of cities encourage more social cohesion. So it's more sort of internal monitoring by a neighborhood, by a community of what's happening and perhaps preventing crime. But it may also relate to the attention restoration, because there's some studies showing that people who don't have green around their homes and if they're in poverty, are in this perpetual state of cognitive and physical stress. So perhaps by introducing some green, they're affecting individual thought, body's response, and so on, that may reduce the propensity to commit a crime. Those of you that are doing more ecologically oriented projects, ecosystem, natural areas, ecologists are now entering this arena of research. And there is if you will, a margin of benefit of being for various health benefits, walking, just passive experience of nature. But what they're finding is if you are in a more biodiverse environment, there's another additional margin of mental health benefit. Really don't know what the complexity, additional complexity. And I was talking with Marisa, one of the conference organizers, the other day, or maybe last night at dinner, maybe a margarita or two has clouded that memory. But that said, we were talking about structure in landscapes, and maybe in urban forestry, we've gone a little too far in focusing only on trees. But if you think about healthy ecosystems, there's multiple layers of structure, within some places, trees being at that topmost or apex level, and other vegetation within that composition. And we see that across all ecosystems, even deserts. So maybe this biodiversity and attention to structure is another way of framing nature for health, depending on the types of places that you work. All right, that was but a sampling, a quick sampling of nature and health for mental health. There's much more of it out there. As I mentioned, it's some of the more robust science with regard to human response for health and wellness and well-being. What I'd like to do now is pivot to across the research that I've just talked about now, as well as research in the earlier session this morning. What do we do about this? How do we take it to action? How do we take it to programs in your community? And perhaps you, in your role as an arborist or an urban forester, you may not initiate these sorts of projects yourself, but perhaps you are invited to provide insight about trees, about projects, or you have an opportunity to partner on a project for sake of, say, social marketing of your business. Hey, we're involved with a school project for children, or we're involved with this hospital and patients in a healing garden. So think of this as something you might incorporate into your work, your partnerships with other organizations, maybe even your own self-care, your own health. How does this translate to how you take time during the day or during the week, or maybe other members of your family or your loved ones? How to incorporate it into their lives? So here are some examples. And I sometimes think of myself as kind of a pollinator, because I'll go to a place and someone will tell me a great idea about something that's happening, and then I'll drop it in other locations, and in this way share ideas. So this is very much a pollination section, because I've not been involved in a lot of these projects, but they seem to be good ideas that are taking off. The first, forest schools, that arc of when you're very young, adult, old age, thinking about that, and how do we develop programs where there are different needs for the facilities. You know, for young children, lots of energy, they need more space. Older people, Very important to have enough seating regularly spaced so they can rest and relax. But forest schools in the state of Washington now, just a short while ago, within this last year, forest schools are now certified as state administered preschools. And that's a big deal because it enables these organizations to access funds and develop credentials for the staff. But they're typically pre-kindergarten. Children spend as much time as possible outdoors, not only across the day, but across an entire year. They're prepared with the proper clothing. There's early academic, but mostly it's socialization. It's how do you engage with other kids when you're building forts, or you're studying little bits of nature, or you see a bug and you try to make sure someone else doesn't squash it. So these schools are really taking off across the nation. Walking, so basic, 120 minutes a week, multiple sessions, doesn't have to be all one time. But less can be more, frankly. So how do we incorporate that into the urban forest and green spaces in particular? Developing programs. I have learned that particularly underserved communities, there are some people who feel uncomfortable going into parks unless they're welcomed, unless they're invited. And a walking program is a very easy way to do that. They can be just general invitation. They can be focused on families. It can be focused on children, school groups, whatever it might be. So that's an easy thought or easy idea. Walking meetings in more of the business community, maybe take that on. I now do walking meetings on occasion with the students. And there's just a different energy when you're walking beside someone and chatting. I have a 30-year-old daughter, and I learned early on that talking with her about sensitive things face to face didn't go so well. But if we could go outside and walk, side by side and, take a little break and look at other stuff, those conversations about things that we had to talk about, but not both of us weren't necessarily all in on it, they went a little better. So think about that for colleagues, for family and households and so on. But in walking, you got to get out of the car, right? Some of you do streetscape plantings, again, in addition to infrastructure conflicts, the incredible challenges of growing trees within that sidewalk or right-of-way zone, but thinking about the connectivity. So maybe there's a park where people are able to walk, and maybe there's another location. So in prioritizing where trees are planted, might you build in the connectivity of shade and more comfort so that people have greater distances to walk? I don't know how you, maybe as you go to parks or outdoor spaces, I get really bored going round and round and round within a single park. I tend to like to roam. And so if there's a connected system of parks, street trees, streetscape, and so on, all built in, that might encourage people to be out and walking around a little bit more. Forest bathing. I mentioned that earlier, forest therapy, forest bathing. There is this organization, ANFT. They provide trainings for guides. They now do this internationally. They also do it online. It used to be all in person. A cohort would move through together. But now they're becoming tree evangelists. Really interesting because they offer a program, but they talk about why this program of tree therapy and tree bathing is really important, or forest bathing. I don't know if there are any here in Albuquerque. There's quite a community of certified guides growing in the Pacific Northwest. So if this is something that starts to take off, gets some traction, again, thinking about the types of places where this activity can happen, because a forest therapy guide is very dependent on local green spaces in order to set up this program, in order to offer it to people. And there are places now where the guides are interacting with the Forest and Parks Management departments to do assessments of the compatibility. Are the trails in good shape? Are there restrooms? What is needed? What are the types of spaces needed for these forest therapy sessions? This is happening in Washington, D.C. There's a doctor there, Dr. Robert Czar, pediatrician, and he is working, as are more and more physicians are working with the regional park system of Washington, D.C. to enable this sort of activity to happen. I've also been consulting with the Forest Service in Mexico, and they're attempting to do a nationwide assessment of forest parcels, ranging from wildland to in city. And now they're looking at, once we have this map, a GIS map of these different places, now can we go in and do a survey or a checklist? That'd be a better term. Can we do a checklist of the suitability of these places for forest therapy? And if so, what are some possible needs or new elements that we need to introduce to these places? So that's another overlay. When we think often about forest or natural area management, it's often about the ecosystem assessment, water quality, wildlife habitat, those soils, vegetation composition. Can we add another overlay about health? And that is the possibility that is starting to emerge in more and more places. Another opportunity for partnership is parks prescription. And again, there are doctors that are actually prescribing, just like they would meds, or hey, you should see this counselor. They are actually prescribing amounts of time, frequency of being out in nature, and they help then their patients identify what sorts of places, ranging from your backyard to part of the park or forest system within a community. And the script, so this organization, Nature RX, has a website that if you find you're talking to a doctor and they're like, tell me more, what's this about? There's this website where they can get the information, including the research backing of this process. They also can find PDF files where they get the scripts. So trying to ease any friction that a doctor might have in adopting this process or adopting this practice and moving it a little more to mainstream. Again, Robert Czar in DC was one of the originators of this idea, this notion, and he is now working with some scientists at the National Institute of Health to try to formally evaluate how patients are responding to this sort of prescription practice. And I'll mention also in Canada, underway, not launched yet, is a network of physicians across the nation. And they have a national health system. So it's a little easier for a physician to connect with other people because they have this national network. It's not as easy to do that here in the United States. But to me, that's an indication of, again, this going mainstream. Parks prescription, walk with a doc is another element of that. So if you partner, say, with a doctor, a clinic, a hospital, and there's a doctor that is willing to go out and do walks with groups of patients. Again, it's like a walking meeting. It's a little different from being in the office. I recently had a physical, and I don't know if you've had this experience, but I go in, you know, the blood pressure, cough and temperature and weight and all that, and then plunk in the chair and sit and wait for the doctor to come in. And the doctor is, his attention is more on the computer screen than it is on me. And there's some very basic questions of, you know, how you doing, this, or what are your meds, da, da, da. But I didn't get the feeling we were having a conversation. I had the feeling that I was filling in a checklist. And so what I'm hearing about Walk with a Doc is it's a little more personal interaction, and it's room for people to ask questions in a more general way about health and wellness. This again is taking off in some parts of the country, Texas being one example. This particular community is in the Conroe area of Texas. And there is a hospital, the Lone Star Family Health Center, and there is a state forest fairly close. I don't think it's adjacent, but it's fairly close. And so there's a partnership between the forest management team at the state level and also the medical community at this hospital. So they're trying Parks prescription. They're also, the doctors are collecting health data that may pertain to their patients being out in nature, with, again, the idea of, in addition to promoting these nature experiences, potentially having a database that formally shows results. And that can take some time. There's so many confounds on the influences of our health, so many determinants of health, that extracting just that little element contributed by nature takes some pretty sophisticated statistics and a fairly large data set. So that's what they're working toward. So can we more intentionally focus on or introduce health in forest management? This is an example from King County, which is metropolitan Seattle. And I was part of a team. We did an iTree eco analysis of Seattle some years ago, which is a focus more on the environmental services. But our team, we continue to talk about, well, what about human health as another element, and what might we do to follow up? So one of the team members he's the key guy that determines, he scans for parcel acquisition to help build out the natural area system of the county. And so what he has begun to do is collaborate to help to understand what is the health potential. In addition, again, to the environmental services checklist, habitat, water management, erosion prevention, flooding, buffering, and so on. He is now trying to think about how health of the adjacent community might be included in this sort of assessment. So a key process in that is a product called a health impact assessment. And people in public health, they've been doing this for decades, where if they are introducing a new public health program in a community, they do a baseline study, and it's called a health impact assessment. And then they introduce an intervention, new park, new walking system, new affordable housing, whatever it might be, and then they do a follow-up health impact assessment. This has rarely been done with regard to nature impacts. So my colleague, Dave, is doing that now on a limited basis. He doesn't have a lot of resources, but he's attempting to do health impact assessments on these new natural areas acquisitions. And in that way, start to try to understand where's the interface of these areas that have primarily many other functions, but that might offer health benefit as well. And what we're learning from that, ecotone. Are you familiar with that term from ecology? Some of you are. Ecotone is this idea that if you have one type of ecosystem adjacent to another, so let's say a water system or a wetland adjacent to a forest, there's no clear, crisp line between these two. There is a buffering area where you see animal movement, you see species, plant species distribution, kind of a mix and match with space. It's known as an ecotone. And those tend to be biologically quite diverse. So what we're talking about is, can we create the human health biological ecotone around these natural areas? So maybe it doesn't serve the natural area functions well to have a lot of people streaming through them, trails and so on, the noise, maybe mountain bikes are moving in and there's some concern about erosion. But can we think about that edge effect and how then people might be potentially benefiting from that near-term or near-distance access? And one example that I heard about recently was, again, an elder care center. And in constructing this center adjacent to a natural area, they looked at what might be a walking loop opportunity, because for elders to be out and about walking, but you need really high quality surface so that they don't trip, fixed distance so they know how far they have gone, or their staff can monitor how far they have walked. And so what we see then is that this edge effect and the ecotone, will do. What we see then is this edge effect and an ecotone potential of being able to think about program that extends from the facility that's primarily oriented to human services into that area or into that zone that can offer ecological as well as health services. So I'm wrapping this up a little early because I think the smells of lunch are starting to waft into the room. Reframing, that's been the theme of my 2 talks today. And I encourage you, your heads are stuffed with all sorts of information, and there's even more to come today. And in processing that, you will use some of that content, translate some of that content to your practice, talk with others about it. And in that, if you could think about how to reframe how you talk about trees with your own professional group and with others in your community, to consider these various health and human dimensions aspects. Mental health is prominent. It is prominent now in the minds of the public. Again, in the variety of invitations I get to talk or to interview or to even speak to school groups, mental health is prominent. So maybe that's a message that you can bring to these conversations. We have now enough evidence to move to action. We can do this translation to programs, to policy, to the things that can make a difference, to the experiences, to the places that can make a big difference in people's lives. And equity is very important in that. For a variety of historical reasons, some communities have not been a part of the nature scheme or nature planning. And I think that's in part, not to put blame, maybe there is some, but not to put a lot of blame, but I think it's in part because public attitude about trees and urban forestry and green spaces has been, well, isn't that nice? You know, but it's not important. It's just nice to have. It's kind of frosting on the cake. We have more important things to pay attention to. One of the reasons I got into this work was an early experience. I was the first urban forester for the city of Key West, Florida. Wasn't that a party? But one year, I remember standing at the podium in front of the city council, making the case for why we needed more budget for trees. And I was shut down so fast because the chief of police was there. The chief of the fire department was there. People were talking about the streets and all of the potholes, and gosh, we had to do something about that. So really quickly, trees got shoved to the side in terms of budgeting and administration. And I had the intuition, young kid, I had the intuition, a little bit of biological knowledge about why trees are important. But I look back on that, and that was a key influence for me sort of taking this unusual route of social science in urban forestry and urban greening. But we now have a wide array of evidence over decades, coming from many places, many circumstances, and we can now work with that. And diversity and equity then is quite important. So I'll end with that. Do we have a bit of time? Have a bit of time. Okay, 5 minutes or so. If anyone has questions, comments, inspirations, I heard a couple of great stories after my last event. Someone pulled me aside, and a couple of people pulled me aside with some great stories. On the other hand, if I see you kind of sneaking out there to get out in the lunch line, I understand that as well. But if you'd like to take a few minutes, please. And I think we have a couple of microphones up here now, or just yell it out. That's fine too. Yeah, thank you. Please. Yeah, the question was, do I think I would be better equipped to make a better case if I were standing at that podium in front of the city council? Absolutely, absolutely. On one hand, as I've explained ad nauseum, the research that's available, and the research is so extensive that I could draw from particular things that were relevant either to individual council members or to key needs or challenges in the community. Another difference is in many communities, and I don't know much about Albuquerque, though I am speaking to more of a volunteer and community group tomorrow morning, we have far more volunteer and stewardship and master gardener and all of those systems in place, and people who are willing, they are in their day jobs, they are in places of power and influence. And so they know how to speak in these situations. And so that's what I find also is finding that local champion that can speak from the citizen or resident standpoint is also quite compelling. So if it were now and I were speaking in front of that city council, I would have a more well-rounded and multiple voice case to be made. That was a quick exit. Look at this room. Completely understand. Thank you.